In a small town in Tennessee, a courtroom becomes the stage for a confrontation that will reveal systemic bias, challenge authority, and inspire change. Our protagonist, Marcus Wright, a seasoned federal prosecutor, steps into what should have been a simple legal hearing about property taxes. What unfolds, however, is a story of prejudice, courage, and the fight for justice that will leave an indelible mark on the community and beyond. This is Prejudiced Gavel, a federal prosecutor's stand against injustice. The warm glow of a Tennessee sunrise spilled across the windshield of Marcus Wright's car as he pulled into the parking lot of the municipal courthouse in Franklin, a quiet town known for its historical charm. It was 8:45 a.m., and Marcus had already felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had planned to arrive earlier to prepare for his hearing. The task at hand, contesting an erroneous property tax increase on the small house his late mother had left him, a home that held memories of her laughter, her guidance, and the principles of fairness she instilled in him. But life had a way of complicating even the simplest of plans. That morning, an urgent call from his team at the U.S. Attorney's office had delayed him. Marcus, as lead prosecutor in a high-profile human trafficking case, had been pulled into an emergency briefing regarding a last-minute defense motion. His commitment to justice had kept him occupied until the very last moment. As he stepped out of his car, Marcus adjusted his navy suit and straightened his tie. A passing breeze ruffled his papers as he closed his briefcase with a decisive snap. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant. Judge Peterson is known for being strict with late arrivals. Be careful. Marcus sighed. The thought of walking into a tense courtroom didn't faze him. He had faced hostile judges before. Still, the reminder lingered in his mind as he ascended the courthouse steps, the cool morning air brushing against his face. Inside, the municipal courthouse was a stark contrast to the polished federal courtrooms Marcus was accustomed to. The beige walls bore the scuffs of decades, and the faint smell of coffee mixed with old paper hung in the air. Clerks shuffled papers behind counters, and citizens clutched documents with looks of anxiety or resignation. Marcus glanced at his watch. 8:57 a.m. barely enough time to find the courtroom. He followed the signs to room 207, where the name Judge Gregory Peterson was etched into the brass plaque on the door. The room was already buzzing with quiet conversations as Marcus entered. He slipped into a seat near the back and pulled out his documents, scanning through the carefully prepared evidence. He was determined to demonstrate that the sudden 25% increase in his property tax was not only unjustified but illegal. Moments later, the bailiff called for order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Gregory Peterson. The room shuffled to its feet as a tall, imposing man with gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes entered. Judge Peterson carried himself with the air of someone who expected compliance and respect at all times. He seated himself, his gaze sweeping across the room like a predator scanning its domain. Marcus watched as the judge began calling cases with brisk efficiency, his tone cold and detached. A man in a rumpled suit who arrived moments late slipped into a seat unnoticed. Then a young woman entered, casual and disheveled, and settled herself in without even a glance from the judge. The discrepancies struck Marcus as odd, but he remained focused on his notes until his name echoed through the room. Marcus Wright. Marcus stood, straightened his tie, and approached the podium, exuding calm confidence. Judge Peterson's eyes met his, and the air in the room seemed to shift. "Mr. Wright," the judge began, his voice cutting through the room with a sharp edge. "You are late. This court does not tolerate tardiness." Marcus inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters involving a human trafficking case." The judge raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Excuses do not justify disrespecting this court's time. You are hereby fined $500 for contempt of court." The words struck like a gavel slamming down. Around the room, murmurs of disbelief rippled. Marcus maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Your Honor," he said, his tone measured, "with all due respect, I believe this fine is unwarranted given the circumstances. May I explain?" "You may not," the judge interrupted, his gavel slamming down to emphasize his authority. "Consider this a lesson in punctuality." Marcus stepped back, his mind racing. The fine wasn't just excessive, it was punitive. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers who had escaped reprimand. The disparity was glaring. This wasn't about rules or respect. It was about something deeper, something more insidious. As Marcus returned to his seat, his legal instincts took over. He began jotting notes in the margins of his file, documenting the events unfolding around him. The fine wasn't the end of the matter. It was only the beginning. Marcus Wright sat quietly in the courtroom, the sting of Judge Peterson's ruling still fresh in his mind. Around him, the usual hum of legal proceedings continued. But Marcus was focused on something else entirely. His sharp legal instincts and years of experience told him that what had just happened wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a symptom of something far more troubling. He observed the room carefully. The young woman who had entered late earlier was now sitting casually near the front, her phone in hand. She hadn't been reprimanded, let alone fined. A middle-aged man in a beige blazer, who had also slipped in moments after the session began, was presenting his case without so much as a mention of his tardiness. The contrast couldn't be ignored. Marcus's pen moved swiftly across his notebook, cataloging every detail: the fine, the judge's tone, the selective enforcement of rules. The inconsistencies were glaring, and he knew they wouldn't hold up to scrutiny if challenged. But this wasn't just about him, it was about fairness and integrity in the justice system. "Next case," Judge Peterson called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned again, but he knew his turn would come soon. He carefully organized the evidence for his property tax dispute, ensuring it was ready for presentation. Yet his mind kept returning to the events that had just unfolded. As the morning session dragged on, Marcus noticed others in the room reacting subtly to what they had witnessed. A woman seated 2 rows ahead whispered to the man beside her, her expression a mix of disbelief and discomfort. An older man in the corner folded his arms, shaking his head slowly. These small gestures spoke volumes. People had noticed the disparity, even if no one dared to voice it aloud. When Judge Peterson finally called Marcus's name again, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Marcus stood, adjusted his suit, and approached the podium with a calm but purposeful stride. "Mr. Wright, are you prepared to proceed with your case?" the judge asked, his tone clipped and dismissive. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, placing a neatly organized folder on the podium. I have evidence here showing that the recent property tax adjustment on my late mother's house was issued in error. The city failed to provide the required notification, and the increase does not align with the property's assessed value. Judge Peterson leaned back in his chair, feigning disinterest. "Present your evidence," he said flatly. Marcus opened the folder, pointing to a specific page. "Here is the original tax assessment for the property. Consistent over the past decade. The new adjustment reflects a 25% increase without justification. I've included correspondence from the city, confirming no official review was conducted." The judge flipped through the pages with disinterest, his expression betraying no reaction. Marcus pressed on. "This house is more than just property to me, Your Honor. It was my mother's home and the place where my family was raised. This increase imposes an undue burden and violates the city's own policies regarding notification and justification for adjustments." For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of acknowledgement in the judge's eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I'll take it under advisement," Judge Peterson said curtly. "You'll receive a written decision in due course." Marcus knew this was the judge's way of brushing off his case. But he wasn't deterred. He had come prepared, not only with evidence but also with resolve. This wasn't the first time he had faced resistance. And it wouldn't be the last. As Marcus returned to his seat, his mind raced. The fine, the selective treatment, the dismissive attitude, each detail painted a larger picture of bias that couldn't be ignored. He glanced around the room again, noting the unease on the faces of those who had witnessed the interaction. An older black man sitting nearby caught Marcus's eye and gave him a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth they both understood. It was a small gesture, but it bolstered Marcus's resolve. This wasn't just about a property tax dispute or a fine for tardiness. It was about standing up against a system that allowed bias to go unchecked. When the session adjourned, Marcus lingered in the hallway, watching as people filed out. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, and Marcus caught snippets of frustration and disbelief. "Did you see how the judge treated him?" a young woman whispered to her companion. "Yeah, but what can you do? It's just the way things are around here," the man replied, shaking his head. Marcus's jaw tightened. The resignation in those words frustrated him, but he understood it all too well. For many, challenging authority seemed futile, but Marcus wasn't just anyone, he was a federal prosecutor, and he had the tools to fight back. He stepped outside, the crisp air cooling his frustration. Pulling out his phone, he began drafting a detailed email to his team at the U.S. Attorney's Office, outlining everything that had transpired. Facts were his weapon, and he intended to wield them effectively. As Marcus sat in his car, reviewing his notes one last time, he made a decision. This wasn't over. He wasn't just going to fight his property tax case, he was going to dig deeper. Uncover the patterns of bias in Judge Peterson's courtroom, and bring them to light. The fine Judge Peterson had imposed wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a call to action. Marcus would ensure that no one else had to face the same injustice. Marcus Wright sat in his office late that evening, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating the pages spread before him. His phone buzzed intermittently, messages from colleagues, reminders for upcoming cases, and a few words of encouragement from friends who had heard about the morning's events. But Marcus's focus was elsewhere. His mind was set on the glaring patterns of disparity he had witnessed in Judge Peterson's courtroom. His email to his team at the U.S. Attorney's Office earlier in the day had sparked an immediate response. Julia Alvarez, his supervisor and a no-nonsense attorney with a keen sense for systemic injustice, had called him within minutes of reading it. "Marcus, this isn't just an isolated incident," she said firmly. "What you're describing aligns with other complaints we've received about Judge Peterson's courtroom. It's time we look deeper." That was all Marcus needed to hear. With Julia's green light, he began building a case, not just against the specific fine levied against him, but against the entire structure of bias that allowed such treatment to flourish. Over the next several days, Marcus pored over public court records, his legal mind meticulously analyzing fines, sentences, and outcomes in cases presided over by Judge Peterson. The numbers painted a damning picture. Black defendants were fined significantly more often and more harshly than white defendants for similar infractions. Late arrivals by black individuals were routinely reprimanded, while those by white individuals often went unnoticed. The disparities were too consistent to be coincidental. The deeper Marcus dug, the more troubling the findings became. He began reaching out to colleagues, other attorneys who had appeared in Peterson's courtroom, former defendants, and even community members who had experienced similar treatment. Many were reluctant to speak up, fearing repercussions, but a few were willing to share their stories. One account came from Elijah Turner, a retired teacher who had been fined $400 for contesting a parking ticket, despite presenting evidence that the citation was issued in error. "It's like he didn't even care what I had to say," Elijah told Marcus over the phone. "He made up his mind the moment I walked into the room." Another came from Deanna Clark, a single mother who described how Judge Peterson had belittled her in open court for requesting a payment plan on a minor zoning violation. Meanwhile, a white defendant in a similar case had been allowed to negotiate his fine with ease. The stories followed a pattern that was both heartbreaking and enraging. Marcus knew he was onto something far larger than his own experience. Word began to spread about Marcus's investigation. Slowly, others started coming forward, their voices adding to the growing chorus of discontent. A young law student, Rachel Porter, who had been in the courtroom during Marcus's hearing, reached out to him after writing about the incident on social media. "Your case opened my eyes," she said when they met at a local coffee shop. "I've been attending sessions in that courtroom for months as part of my internship, and I've seen the same thing you described. It's time someone does something about it." Rachel provided Marcus with notes she had taken during her observations, further corroborating the patterns he had uncovered. Meanwhile, local activist groups caught wind of the investigation. Members of Justice for Franklin, a grassroots organization advocating for fairness in the legal system, began rallying around Marcus's findings. They held meetings, circulated petitions, and started organizing a peaceful demonstration outside the courthouse. "We've been saying for years that the system here is broken," said Angela Harris, one of the group's leaders. "Marcus is just proving what we already knew. Now we have the evidence to back it up." As Marcus's investigation gained momentum, he decided it was time to confront the courthouse staff directly. He arranged a meeting with Linda Novak, the court clerk who had worked under Judge Peterson for over a decade. Linda was hesitant at first, her loyalty to the institution clear. But Marcus's persistence and his commitment to justice began to sway her. "You're not the first person to ask questions," Linda admitted quietly, but no one ever followed through. They were too afraid of the fallout. She paused, her gaze drifting to a small notebook on her desk. "I've been keeping notes over the years," she said finally. "Times, dates, cases where something didn't sit right. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe I just needed a way to process it all. But I think it's time someone else saw them." The notebook Linda handed over was a treasure trove of evidence. It detailed years of unequal treatment, complete with dates, names, and specific rulings, combined with Marcus's own findings. It created an irrefutable case against Judge Peterson. By the end of the week, Marcus and Julia compiled their findings into a formal complaint to the Tennessee Judicial Review Board. The report was comprehensive, highlighting systemic disparities and providing concrete examples of bias. Alongside the complaint, Marcus submitted sworn affidavits from multiple witnesses and former defendants, as well as Linda's notebook. The submission sparked immediate action. Investigators from the board descended on the courthouse, demanding records, interviewing staff, and reviewing case outcomes. Judge Peterson's behavior was no longer a secret, it was under a microscope. For Marcus, the fight was far from over. He knew that systemic change required more than exposing one judge's misconduct. It meant challenging the very foundation of bias that permeated the system. And he was ready to take that fight as far as it needed to go. The investigation into Judge Peterson's courtroom sent shockwaves through the small town of Franklin and beyond. Within days of the Tennessee Judicial Review Board's involvement, news of the inquiry began to spread. Local newspapers picked up the story first, followed by regional outlets. By the end of the week, the headline was making its way to national audiences. Bias in the courtroom, federal prosecutor challenges judges' disparities. Marcus Wright found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters flooded his phone, and his inbox was filled with inquiries from advocacy groups, lawyers, and citizens who had faced similar injustices in their communities. While Marcus was no stranger to the public eye, the attention felt overwhelming. The people of Franklin reacted to the controversy with mixed emotions. On one side, activists and marginalized community members rallied behind Marcus's efforts. The group Justice for Franklin organized a peaceful protest outside the courthouse, drawing dozens of supporters with signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End the bias." "This isn't just about Judge Peterson," said Angela Harris during a speech at the rally. "This is about every person who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or punished unfairly. It's about demanding accountability from a system that's supposed to protect us." On the other side, Judge Peterson's defenders, including longtime allies and influential figures in the town, accused Marcus of overstepping his bounds. Judge Peterson has served this community for decades. One supporter argued during a town hall meeting, "This attack on his integrity is nothing more than a witch hunt by outsiders trying to change our way of life." The divide was palpable. Marcus had expected resistance, but the intensity surprised even him. Still, he remained undeterred. He knew that systemic change often came with backlash, and he was prepared to face it. As the Judicial Review Board's investigation deepened, evidence of systemic bias became undeniable. Court records revealed that over the past 5 years, Black defendants in Judge Peterson's courtroom had been fined an average of 3 times more than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Late arrivals by black individuals were disproportionately penalized, while white defendants frequently faced no consequences. Linda Novak's notebook proved to be a pivotal piece of evidence. Her detailed entries painted a clear picture of unequal treatment that spanned years. Investigators also uncovered troubling anecdotes from courthouse staff, including James Morgan, the courtroom bailiff. "I've worked with Judge Peterson for 15 years," James confessed during an interview with investigators. "And I've seen how differently he treats people depending on who they are. I always felt it wasn't my place to speak up. But now I realize staying silent only made it worse." The most damning discovery came in the form of an internal memo from Judge Peterson himself, instructing clerks to prioritize cases based on what he called practical judgments. The language was vague, but its implications were clear. Implicit bias had been codified into practice. As more evidence came to light, public support for Marcus's fight swelled. The hashtag Justice in Franklin began trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom bias. Advocacy groups across the country used the case as a rallying cry for broader judicial reform. National news outlets covered the story extensively, with some even inviting Marcus for interviews, while he declined most requests. Preferring to keep the focus on the investigation, he agreed to one televised interview with a major network. "This isn't about me," Marcus said during the interview. "It's about ensuring that the justice system works for everyone, not just a select few. If we can shine a light on the problems here, we can start addressing them in other communities as well." His words resonated with viewers, sparking further conversations about systemic bias in the legal system. Under mounting pressure, Judge Peterson finally issued a public statement. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by his legal counsel, he addressed the allegations. "I have always conducted my courtroom with the utmost integrity," Peterson said, his voice firm but his expression betraying unease. "Any perceived disparities in my rulings are unintentional and do not reflect my commitment to justice." The statement rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. For many, it was too little, too late. Behind closed doors, Peterson faced increasing scrutiny. Rumors circulated that he had been called into multiple meetings with the Judicial Review Board and was considering resignation to avoid further embarrassment. His authority in the courtroom waned as more and more people questioned his impartiality. While the investigation continued, Marcus focused on consolidating the evidence and preparing for the next phase. He reached out to other federal prosecutors and civil rights attorneys, forming a coalition to advocate for broader judicial reforms in Tennessee. "This fight doesn't end with one judge," Marcus told the group during a virtual meeting. "If we want real change, we need to address the root causes of bias and hold the entire system accountable." The coalition began drafting proposals for statewide reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. In Franklin, the courthouse became a focal point for change. Staff members who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered to share their experiences. James Morgan, the bailiff, started leading training sessions for courthouse personnel, emphasizing the importance of fairness and impartiality. Linda Novak was promoted to a leadership role in the clerk's office, where she implemented new policies to ensure transparency and accountability. For Marcus, the fight was far from over, but as he walked through the streets of Franklin one evening, seeing signs of unity and determination among the community, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This is just the beginning, he thought to himself, but it's a step in the right direction. The sun rose over Franklin, Tennessee, illuminating a town forever changed by the events of the past few weeks. What had started as a single fine levied unfairly against federal prosecutor Marcus Wright had grown into a full-blown movement for judicial reform, exposing deep systemic biases and rallying a community to demand accountability. For Marcus, the journey was far from over, but the progress was undeniable. On this crisp autumn morning, he stood outside the courthouse where it all began, preparing to address a crowd of community members, activists, and media. Inside the courthouse, the transformation was visible. The tired beige walls had been repainted in calming blues and whites, and new signage guided visitors to resources like payment plans, legal aid, and procedural information. A small but significant plaque now hung in the lobby. Justice is the foundation of freedom. Let fairness guide us. This wasn't just a symbolic change. It represented the tangible reforms implemented since the Judicial Review Board's inquiry into Judge Peterson's courtroom. Peterson had officially resigned after the board's findings revealed a consistent pattern of racial bias in his rulings. The final report from the board was damning. It detailed how Peterson had fined black defendants 3 to 4 times more often than their white counterparts, dismissed legitimate requests for leniency, and selectively enforced courtroom rules. The report also noted systemic failures beyond Peterson, calling for statewide reforms to address implicit bias in judicial proceedings. Peterson's resignation sent shockwaves through the state. Advocacy groups, inspired by Marcus's actions, began scrutinizing other judges and court systems across Tennessee. The coalition Marcus helped form worked tirelessly to propose and push for legislation that would make such disparities harder to hide. Key measures included mandatory bias training for judges. Every judge in the state was now required to undergo regular training sessions to recognize and combat implicit bias. Transparent case audits. Independent oversight committees reviewed court decisions annually to ensure fairness and consistency. Community oversight panels. Local communities could now participate in monitoring their court systems, offering a direct voice in judicial accountability. Marcus watched as these changes took root, knowing they wouldn't solve everything overnight but feeling confident they were steps in the right direction. That morning, as Marcus prepared to speak at the courthouse, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. His framed $500 fine hung prominently in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the injustice that had sparked the movement. Below it, he had pinned a handwritten letter from an elderly man who had attended Peterson's courtroom for decades. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." The letter read, "You gave us hope when we thought there was none left." The crowd outside the courthouse was larger than Marcus had expected. Activists held signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability is key." Young students from local law schools, inspired by Marcus's actions, had organized their own initiatives to promote fairness in the legal system. Among the crowd, Marcus spotted familiar faces: Elijah Turner, the retired teacher; Rachel Porter, the law student who had helped document the disparities; and Angela Harris, the leader of Justice for Franklin. Stepping to the podium, Marcus took a moment to let the weight of the moment settle. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but warm. "Standing here today, I'm reminded of a simple truth. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about people. It's about how we treat those who come into our courtrooms, how we listen to their stories, and how we ensure that fairness is not just an ideal, but a reality." He paused, looking out at the crowd. What happened in this courthouse was wrong. But what's more important is how we responded. Together, we've taken a stand, not just against one judge, but against a system that allowed bias to persist unchecked. We've proven that when we come together, we can create change. The crowd erupted in applause. But Marcus raised his hand for quiet. "This isn't the end of the fight. It's the beginning. There's still work to do, here in Franklin, across Tennessee, and throughout our country. But today, we celebrate progress. We celebrate the power of truth, courage, and community." As the crowd dispersed, Marcus stayed behind, walking through the halls of the courthouse one more time. He visited the newly established Judicial Ethics Center, a resource for judges, lawyers, and citizens to report and address concerns about bias and misconduct. The center's director, Linda Novak, greeted him warmly. "You started this," she said with a smile, "and we'll make sure it keeps going." Marcus nodded, humbled by her words. His fight for justice had become something much bigger than himself, a movement that would continue long after he was gone. Months later, Marcus was invited to speak at a law school seminar titled Ethics and Civil Rights in the Judiciary. As he shared his story with the students, he saw their eyes light up with determination. After the lecture, a young woman approached him, her notebook filled with ideas for reform. "You've shown us that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Marcus smiled, hearing echoes of his own journey in her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied, "but if we all do our part, we can make the system better, for everyone." The story of Franklin and Marcus Wright became a symbol of hope and change across the nation. It reminded everyone that justice isn't static, it's something we must continually fight for, protect, and improve. The story of Marcus Wright and the fight for justice in Franklin, Tennessee, reminds us that even in the face of systemic challenges, one person's courage can ignite change. It's a testament to the power of resilience, fairness, and the unwavering belief that justice must serve everyone equally, not just a select few. This isn't just Marcus's story, it's our story. It's a call to examine the systems around us, to hold those in power accountable, and to advocate for a world where dignity and fairness are not privileges but rights for all. As we move forward, let us remember that the fight for justice isn't won in a day or even a lifetime. It's a continuous journey, and each of us has a role to play, whether by speaking out against injustice, supporting those who champion change, or simply treating others with kindness and respect. We can build a world where fairness and equality thrive. Stand up for what's right. Don't be afraid to speak up when you see injustice, even if it feels daunting. Every voice matters, and every action counts. Value equality, treat everyone with respect and fairness, regardless of their background, race, or status. True progress begins with how we treat one another. Listen and learn. Take time to listen to the stories and experiences of others. Empathy is the foundation of understanding and change. Be persistent. Change doesn't happen overnight. Stay committed to your principles and trust that perseverance can lead to progress. Support your community. Engage with local initiatives, organizations, or causes that work toward building a fairer society. Collective action amplifies impact. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice and resilience. If you found this story inspiring, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with the most compelling stories from around the world. Your support helps us continue to bring you tales of courage, hope, and the human spirit, all for free. Let's build a community of listeners who believe in making a difference. Subscribe now and be part of the movement. Together, we'll uncover, share, and learn from the stories that shape our world. See you in the next story.